In 1885, it was technically illegal in many parts of America for a deaf woman to marry. The man who invented the telephone had made sure of it. So when Alina Shaw, 28 and profoundly deaf, stepped off the train in Cedar Ridge, Montana, as a mail-order bride, she wasn't just entering a stranger's life. She was walking into a society that had already been told she shouldn't exist. Her advertisement had said, "Hardworking widow seeks fresh start." It omitted one detail: she was deaf. The man waiting for her, Thomas Reed, had asked for a wife who could listen, and now he was about to discover she never would. This is the story of what happens when the one thing you're rejected for becomes the only bridge to being seen. Thomas Reed stood on the platform, a man shaped by silent burdens. His brother's ranch was failing, his hands were full with cattle and debt, and the letter in his pocket requested a woman who could listen to the needs of a quiet house. He saw Alina Shaw descend the train steps, her posture too straight, her eyes avoiding the crowd. He offered his hand. She did not take it. She was staring at his mouth. The journey to the Reed homestead was 17 miles of crushing silence. Thomas, a man of few words, found all of them trapped in his throat. He shouted directions over the wagon's roar, only to watch her face, pale and composed, give no indication she heard. He waved a hand. She flinched. By the time they rattled up the dirt drive, a cold knot had formed in his gut. He had not bought a wife. He had acquired a problem. The ranch was a testament to struggle. The main house sagged on one side. Fence posts lay stacked like dead soldiers. 5 head of cattle lowed in a parched field. Thomas's younger brother, Silas, had succumbed to pneumonia 2 winters prior, leaving the land and its debts to a man more comfortable with animals than people. Thomas needed a partner, not a passenger. As he helped Alina down, her grip was firm, surprising. She pointed to the house, then to herself, a question in her raised brows. He just nodded. Inside, the silence grew texture. The bang of a pot was a shock. The scrape of a chair leg on pine planks made her turn wide-eyed. He tried to explain the chores, the pump out back, the wood stove, the root cellar. He spoke slowly, then loudly. Her responses were polite, confused smiles or simple nods that clearly meant nothing. Frustration, sharp and hot, rose in his chest. That first supper was beans and salt pork eaten in a void. He watched her, she watched his hands. Word travels fast in a place with nothing else to do. By Sunday, the folks of Cedar Ridge had concluded 2 things. First, Thomas Reed had been swindled. Second, the swindle was sitting right there in the 3rd pew, her gloved hands folded, her gaze fixed blankly on the hymn book. The preacher's sermon that day was, providentially, about the virtue of listening to the Lord's calling. Women patted Thomas's arm with pity. Men averted their eyes. After the service, the town's only doctor, a man who believed deafness was a moral failing of the nerves, cornered Thomas by the water pump. "He can't have paid much for her, can he?" The doctor chuckled. "I'd wager she's about as useful as a broken bridle." Rejection is a language Alina understood fluently. It was in the way the women at the general store turned their backs, their whispered conversations a visible rhythm she could not decode. It was in the impatient slam of a ledger book when she couldn't answer the storekeeper's price. It was in the cruel, slow enunciation of children who mimicked her strained voice when she tried to speak. Her world, which had always been quiet, was now becoming actively hostile. Her advertisement had been a desperate fiction. A widow, yes. Her husband, a shipwright lost to a fever. But hardworking meant she could sew a straight seam, could preserve berries, could mend a sock with thread so fine it was invisible. Skills that required eyes and hands, not ears. She taught herself to read lips in a world that thought it was teaching her to be silent. But here, in this raw territory, men's faces were bearded, their words mumbled through mustaches, their accents thick as gruel. Her primary map was gone. The ranch became a theater of accidents. A pot left on the stove until the bottom burned through because she didn't hear it boiling over. A gate left unlatched, allowing 2 prized hens to vanish to the foxes because she didn't hear his shout to close it. One afternoon, Thomas returned from checking fences to find the pump handle broken, the mechanism jammed with a stone. He found Alina nearby, her dress soaked, her knuckles bloody from trying to force the handle. She had been trying to draw water for 3 hours. He didn't see determination. He saw ruin. He threw his hat on the ground in a cloud of dust. "This ain't working," he roared, knowing it was useless. She read the fury in his posture, the set of his jaw. She took a step back, her own hands closing into fists at her sides, not in anger, but in a profound, familiar resignation. That night he wrote the letter. It was to the agency back east, a demand for a partial refund, an explanation of the defective goods. The kerosene lamp flickered as he formed the blunt, angry words. In the bedroom above, Elena sat on the edge of the narrow bed. In her lap was a small, cloth-bound journal. She opened it to a page filled not with words, but with a flowing, intricate series of hand shapes, arrows, and notations. It was a personal dictionary of signs, some learned from a deaf, stable hand in her youth, others of her own invention, a secret language. She traced a sign, a closed fist tapped over the heart. It meant sorry. She had drawn it after burning the pot. She had made the sign to Thomas's back. He had never seen it. The following morning, a new tension arrived. A letter came for Thomas, not from the agency, but from the bank in Billings. The note was formal, final. The loan taken out by his brother was called due, 90 days. If he could not show proof of productive improvement on the land, more than a single man could manage, the property would be forfeit. The banker's elegant script was a death sentence. Thomas stood on the porch, the paper trembling in his hand. His gaze swept over the failing ranch, then landed on Elena, who was attempting to hang laundry, misreading the wind and pegging a sheet so it would wrap around the line. A useless woman on a useless piece of land. The math was brutal and complete. He found her in the kitchen, scrubbing the same spot on the table. He didn't try to speak. He simply held up the bank notice, then pointed at her, then at the eastbound road beyond the window. His meaning was unmistakable. You go. Her face, usually so carefully guarded, crumbled. It was not the rejection from the town. This was the rejection of last resort. She had nowhere to go back to. The agency would not take her. She was officially unmovable inventory. But then she did something unexpected. She walked to the shelf, took down the flour canister, and from its hollow heart she pulled out a small, folded pile of banknotes. Her own meager savings hidden. She laid them on the table beside the banker's letter. Then she pointed to the broken pump outside, to the sagging fence, to the overgrown kitchen garden. She pointed to the money, then to those things, then finally to herself. Her meaning was just as clear: use me. The money on the table was a ceasefire, not trust, but a temporary truce. Thomas took the notes, a silent admission of defeat. He would hire a man to fix the pump, buy wire for the fences. Her role was reduced to a single, silent directive: stay out of the way. But Elena Shaw had just bought herself 90 days, and she had no intention of being a ghost in her own life. She started with the garden, a plot of hard-baked clay behind the house, given up for dead. While Thomas rode to town for supplies, she took the hoe, her hands blistering within an hour. She worked not by sound, but by a new calculus of observation. She watched the path of the sun, the way the dust settled, which weeds were brittle and which were stubbornly alive. She began to chart the ranch not as a series of chores, but as a map of visual problems. The loose porch plank that sagged when stepped on, the specific way the smoke from the chimney curled when the flue was clogged. She became a student of consequence, not instruction. Thomas returned with a hired hand, a gruff older man named Hanks, to repair the pump. They worked for 2 hours, their voices a low, meaningless rumble to Elena, who watched from the garden. When they finished, Hanks strode over to Thomas, wiping his hands on his pants. He nodded toward Elena. Can't hear a damn thing, can she? Thomas shook his head. A pity, Hanks said, not lowering his voice. Pretty thing, though. Waste. He said it like commenting on a broken wagon wheel. Elena kept her eyes on the soil, but her face burned. She made the sign for anger, a flick of fingers near her temple, hidden in the fold of her skirt. A week later, the first test arrived. A merchant from Billings came to collect on an old debt of Silas's, $50 for seed that had never yielded a crop. Thomas had 13. The merchant, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, threatened to take a calf as collateral. From the porch, Elena watched the tension in Thomas's shoulders, the desperate shake of his head. She disappeared inside. When she returned, she carried a bundle wrapped in brown paper. She unfolded it before the merchant. It was a quilt, not a simple patchwork, but a breathtaking scene of a mountain valley stitched in thread of 100 subtle colors, the work of countless silent hours. The merchant's avarice flickered, then glowed. His wife collected such things. He offered $40 for it. Thomas stared, stunned. Elena nodded once sharply. The debt was cleared. The merchant left with the quilt. Thomas was left with a new, unsettling equation. The useless woman had just saved a calf. That night he did not eat in silence. He pushed his plate aside, took a piece of charcoal from the stove, and sketched on the wood table a crude calf, then a question mark. He looked at her, she understood. From her apron pocket, she produced a small scrap of paper and a pencil nub. She wrote in a careful, sloping hand, "My mother taught me. The thread was my voice." She slid the paper to him. It was the first true communication that had passed between them. He read it, then looked at her hands, small, calloused, capable of creating something worth $40. He pointed to the garden, then raised his brows. She nodded. He pointed to the fence line, a question. She shook her head, then mimed the action of heavy lifting and shrugged. Not strong enough. He almost smiled. It was a plan, a terrible, silent plan. The next morning, he did not ride out alone. He gestured for her to follow. He led her to the tool shed, showed her the nails, the wire stretchers, the post hole digger. He demonstrated slowly how to use each one. He didn't shout. He moved with deliberate clarity. She watched, her eyes missing nothing. When he handed her a pair of work gloves, it felt less like a gift and more like a treaty. That afternoon, they worked on opposite ends of the same fence line. He saw her struggle with the digger, her slight frame battling the earth. He didn't help. He waited. He saw her stop, think, then use her body weight in a different way, leveraging the tool. She got the hole dug, a small victory witnessed only by the hawks circling overhead. But the outside world was not so easily negotiated. A trip to Cedar Ridge for staples became a gauntlet. At the general store, the owner, Mr. Gable, refused to look at Alina. He spoke only to Thomas, loudly and slowly, as if Thomas were also impaired. "Does she need sugar?" Alina, reading his lips, felt a hot shame. She touched Thomas's arm and shook her head. She pointed to the barrel of beans, then held up 2 fingers. Thomas relayed the order. As they left, Gable muttered to his clerk, just loud enough, "Better he bought a dog, at least it hears." Thomas stopped, his back rigid. He turned, and for a second, Alina thought he might speak, but he didn't. He walked on, the shame now shared, a heavier burden. The isolation forged a strange partnership. Alina began leaving notes for him on the kitchen table. Henhouse latch loose, smoke from north pasture. One morning, she left a drawing of a cow with a swollen udder. Thomas found the heifer in distress an hour later, a potentially fatal case of mastitis he'd missed. He treated it, saving the animal and its valuable milk. That evening, he left a note for her beside the wash basin. 2 words, "Thank you." It was the first acknowledgement of her worth that didn't involve currency. Then the rain came, a sudden violent prairie storm that turned the yard to mud and the sky black. Thomas was out securing the cattle. Inside, Alina was mending when the world through the window flared white. A deafening crack of thunder she didn't hear, but she felt it, a vibration through the floorboards, a pressure change in her skull. The kerosene lantern flickered wildly, and then she saw it, a faint, terrible thread of smoke curling from the wall near the stovepipe. A lightning strike. The house, dry as tinder, was beginning to smolder inside its own walls. Thomas, fighting the wind and rain, saw nothing amiss from outside. Inside, Alina acted. She threw a bucket of wash water at the wall. It hissed, but the smoke persisted. She couldn't shout for help. She ran to the door, but Thomas was nowhere in the storm's gloom. Panic, the silent, screaming kind, closed her throat. Then her eyes landed on the dinner bell hanging from the porch eaves, used to call men in from far fields. She seized the rope and began to swing the clapper with all her strength. She couldn't hear the frantic, clanging alarm, but she could feel the vibration racing up the rope, through her bones. She rang and rang, a silent woman making the loudest noise she possibly could. Thomas heard it over the wind. A bell ringing in a storm was a universal scream of distress. He came at a run, sliding in the mud. He burst inside to find her, soaked and wild-eyed, pointing at the smoking wall. He tore at the wooden siding from the inside with his bare hands, finding the charred, glowing timber beneath. He smothered it with damp sacking. The crisis passed. They stood in the wreckage of the wall, breathing heavily, water dripping from them both. He looked from the bell rope still swaying outside to her. He hadn't told her about the bell. She had just known. In that moment, she wasn't a liability. She was the reason the house was still standing. Something broke open after that, not conversation, but a new layer of noticing. He saw how she watched the world, the flicker of a cow's ear showing agitation, the specific posture of a horse about to shy. She saw the ranch with different eyes, and he began to see her seeing it. He found her journal one day left open on the bench. He saw the strange, beautiful diagrams of hands. He didn't understand it, but he recognized it as a language, a system. It terrified and fascinated him. He made his first attempt the next evening. He pointed to himself, then made a clumsy gesture of tipping a hat. He pointed to her, then made the same gesture. He was trying to say Thomas and Alina. His signs were nothing from her book. They were his own invention, but she understood the intent. Her eyes widened. Slowly, she reached out and adjusted his hand, shaping his fingers into a T tapped against his chest. Then she took his hand and formed an E against her own. It was the first touch that wasn't functional. It was pedagogical. It was a bridge. Word of the deaf woman who rang the bell filtered through Cedar Ridge, warping in the telling. Some said she'd saved the ranch. Others whispered she'd caused the lightning strike, that her silence was an affront to God. The doctor, emboldened by gossip, paid a visit. He found Alina in the garden and proceeded to shout simple words at her, demanding she repeat them. Apple, book, home, spittle flew. Alina stood frozen, a rabbit before a snake. Thomas came around the corner, his face dark. The doctor turned to him. Reed, this is a fool's errand. The oral method is the only way. She must be made to speak. This gesturing is for savages. Thomas, a man who had never contradicted a professional in his life, spoke quietly. She saved my house, doctor. Can you say the same? He then did something extraordinary. He walked to Alina, positioned himself so she could see his lips, and said slowly, clearly, "You can go inside." He didn't shout. He enunciated. She read his lips, nodded, and walked away, leaving the doctor sputtering. It was a declaration of allegiance. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He went to the kitchen and found Alina's journal still there. He sat down with a pencil and a clean sheet of paper. He drew a crude bell, then he drew a stick figure ringing it. He pushed the paper across the table to her. She looked at it, then back at him. She picked up the pencil. Below his drawing, she drew a simple house, then a flame next to it, then an X over the flame. She pointed to him, then to the drawing of the bell ringer. The message was clear. You heard me. You saved the house. He had not just heard the bell. He had heard asterisk her asterisk. The 90 days were slipping away. The bank's deadline loomed, a shadow stretching longer each sunset. The ranch was improving, but was it enough? Thomas knew the banker, a man named Carruthers, would need to see not just repaired fences, but proof of viable future income. He needed a miracle crop, a new herd, something undeniable. All he had was a slightly better ranch and a wife who communicated in drawings and makeshift signs. The crisis arrived on horseback. Carruthers, the banker, came early, a well-dressed man with a gold watch chain, surveying the property with a dismissive eye. He noted the repaired pump, the new fence posts. "Costly, Mr. Reed," he said. "And this is the wife." He looked Alina up and down as she stood on the porch. "I hear strange things." Thomas's jaw tightened. Carruthers presented the formal foreclosure notice. "The board is not convinced of productivity. The debt is due in full in 7 days." He was turning to leave when Alina suddenly stepped forward. She held up one finger. "Wait." She disappeared into the house and returned with 2 things: the ledger where Thomas kept his sparse accounts, and her quilt-making basket filled with vibrant thread and a half-finished panel depicting a meadow of wildflowers. She set them both on the porch rail. She pointed to the ledger, then shook her head, tapping the meager numbers. Then she pointed to the quilt, to the garden where a few green shoots were finally visible, to the healthy calf in the pen. She looked from the bankrupt ledger to the tangible proof of creation and survival around her, then finally, directly into Carruthers's confused eyes. Her meaning was a silent shout: "Which one truly measures the worth of this land?" Carruthers, the banker, did not see a profound argument. He saw a pantomime by a defective woman. A slow, condescending smile spread across his face. "A quilt and some bean sprouts," he said to Thomas, as if Alina were not there. "The board deals in dollars, Mr. Reed, not in embroidery, but you have 7 days. Perhaps you can stitch a solution." The banker's departing laughter was a knife in the quiet. Thomas stood paralyzed, the foreclosure notice crisp in his hand. The fragile bridge he and Alina had built felt like it was made of smoke. He turned to her, and the look on her face wasn't defeat. It was a cold, clear fury. She snatched the notice from him, read the legal jargon with startling speed, and crumpled it in her fist. She pointed to the sun, traced its arc across the sky 7 times, then slammed her closed fist into her open palm. The message was unmistakable: fight. But how? They had no cash, no collateral except the land itself. That night, Thomas made a desperate decision. He would take the remaining 3 prime heifers to the auction in Miles City, a 2-day ride. It was a gamble. Selling breeding stock was like eating your seed corn, but it might raise enough to stave off the bank. He explained his plan to Alina with drawings and gestures, him leaving with cattle, returning with money. She nodded, but her eyes were distant, calculating. As he prepared to leave at dawn, she handed him a note. Sell to anyone but Carruthers' cousin. His buyer wears a silver pin. She had been observing, remembering. Thomas folded the note, a strange warmth in his chest. She was protecting their assets. With Thomas gone, the ranch's silence changed. It was no longer a barrier but a domain. Elena walked the property with a new purpose. In the overgrown patch near the creek, she found wild raspberry canes. In the old barn loft, she discovered a crate of forgotten apple seeds, probably from Silas's time. She worked with a frantic, focused energy, but she was not alone. On the second afternoon, she saw a rider approaching from the town road. It was the doctor, and he was not alone. With him was the preacher from Cedar Ridge. He confronted her on the porch. The doctor spoke first, shouting, "We are here as concerned citizens, Mrs. Reed. Your condition, it brings a spiritual malaise." The lightning strike was a sign. The preacher, a kinder man but bound by dogma, added more gently, "My child, we wish to pray with you, to appeal for healing, to make you whole." Elena understood enough. They saw her not as a person, but as a problem to be fixed, a blight on their community's righteousness. She shook her head, stepping back. The doctor moved forward, reaching for her arm, perhaps to force her to kneel. Elena's reaction was instinctual. She brought her hands up between them, not to push, but to form a sign from her journal, a sharp, sweeping gesture that meant stop or away. The men froze, staring at her moving hands as if she'd conjured a snake. "Witchcraft," the doctor hissed. "She speaks in devil's signs." They left then, but the threat in their eyes was a new kind of foreclosure. Thomas returned from Miles City with worn-out hope. He had sold the heifers, but the price was low. He laid the money on the table. It was enough to pay the interest, perhaps to buy another month, but not to clear the debt. He was exhausted, defeated. Elena looked at the money, then at his face. She reached out and touched his hand, a brief, startling contact. She then pointed firmly to the ledger, to the money, and shook her head. She pointed out the window to the garden, to the barn, and nodded emphatically. She wasn't accepting the plan. She had a new one. She showed him her discoveries, the raspberries, the apple seeds. She pantomimed making preserves, drying fruit, planting an orchard. She pointed to the quilt basket. Then she drew a simple sign, both hands shaping a jar, then a coin dropping into a palm. She was proposing they create something to sell, not just sell what they already had. Thomas, mired in the logic of livestock and land, stared at her. Jam, apples, against a bank debt. It seemed absurd. But her eyes were blazing with a conviction he hadn't seen before. He had no better ideas. With a sigh that was its own form of surrender, he nodded. The next 5 days were a blur of shared, silent labor. He built drying racks and helped clear the land for a proper orchard plot. She boiled berries and sugar, stitching tiny "R. Reed Ranch" labels onto cloth scraps for the jars. They communicated in a shorthand of gestures, nods, and shared looks. He learned the sign for water, for hot, for more. She learned to read the subtle tension in his shoulders that meant worry. The outside world, with its condemnation and deadlines, faded behind a wall of pure, productive focus. On the 6th day, the crisis mutated. It wasn't the bank that arrived, but the law. The sheriff of Cedar Ridge, a stern man named Pike, rode up with the doctor at his side. He served Thomas with a different kind of paper, a petition signed by several townsmen, citing public disturbance and spiritual concern regarding Elena's unnatural condition and communicative methods. It was a veiled threat, a warning that she could be deemed a nuisance or even unstable and removed. The doctor smirked. "We just want what's best, Reed, for the town's peace." This was no longer about money, it was about her right to exist in that place. Thomas saw red. The quiet man who had absorbed every insult finally snapped. He took the petition, tore it in two, and dropped the pieces at the sheriff's feet. "Get off my land," he said, his voice low and deadly. "She stays, you go." The sheriff, surprised by the defiance, rested a hand on his gun belt. "Don't make this difficult, son." It was then that Elena walked out of the house. She was holding a freshly sealed jar of raspberry preserves, the ruby red glowing in the sun. She walked right past the armed men, placed the jar on the porch rail, and then turned to face the doctor. Slowly, deliberately, she made a series of signs, one for fear, one for ignorance, and finally one she invented on the spot, a flick of her fingers from her eyes outward, meaning "you see nothing." She then picked up the jar and handed it to the stunned sheriff. A gift or a challenge? The sheriff looked from the beautiful, defiant woman to the furious man, to the ridiculous jar of jam. He took it, nodded once, and turned his horse. "7 days, Reed," he called over his shoulder. The bank's matter still stands. The dual countdown was now unbearable. The bank's financial acts and the town's gathering bigotry. That night, Thomas made a decision born of sheer desperation. He remembered an old, played-out silver claim in the hills that sealers had once owned the rights to. It was worthless, but the deed might look like an asset to a desperate banker from back east. It was a shady, last-ditch idea. He tried to explain it to Alina, drawing a mountain and a shining rock. She frowned, then drew a stick figure falling off the mountain. She pointed to him, then to the drawing, and shook her head violently. It was too dangerous, a fool's errand. They argued in their stilted way, his gestures growing frustrated, hers adamant. For the first time, their unity fractured under the pressure. At dawn he went anyway. He left a note. "Back tomorrow, sell the preserves in town if you can." It was an order and an admission that her plan was now part of the strategy. Alina watched him ride away, a hollow fear in her stomach. She loaded the wagon with 2 crates of preserves, a few quilts, and a bravery she didn't feel. She drove herself to Cedar Ridge. The market square was a wall of sound she could not hear, but she felt the hostility like a physical wave. Women gathered in clusters, whispering. Mr. Gable from the store came out, waving his arms. "We don't want your witchcraft jam," he shouted, his face purple. Children threw clods of dirt that hit her dress. Alina stood by her wagon, her chin high, her hands trembling. She held up a jar, pointing to the label. A man spat near her feet. This was total, annihilating rejection. She was about to climb back into the wagon, utterly broken, when a hand touched her elbow. It was an older woman, Mrs. Porter, the blacksmith's wife, a woman known for her own quiet, difficult life. She had a kind, worn face. She didn't shout. She looked Alina in the eye, then slowly, carefully shaped a sign with her own work-roughened hands. It was clumsy but recognizable, the sign for good, a flat hand patted against the lips. She had been watching. She had learned. She then took a coin from her purse, placed it in Alina's hand, and took a jar of preserves. It was a silent transaction that spoke volumes. Then another woman, a young mother whose own child was considered slow by the town, stepped forward. She didn't sign, but she smiled and bought a jar. Then another. The dam of prejudice didn't break, but a tiny, defiant crack formed. Alina returned to the ranch with empty crates and a handful of coins. It wasn't enough to save the land, but it was enough to save her spirit. She waited for Thomas. He did not come back that night. The next morning, as a grim fog settled in the valleys, she saw his horse trotting riderless up the lane, saddle askew. Her heart stopped. The horse had come home alone. Thomas was out there, somewhere, hurt or worse. The bank, the town, the petition, none of it mattered anymore. The only thing that mattered was the man who had torn up a legal paper for her, and he was gone. Alina didn't hesitate. She didn't wait for a man who wasn't coming. She saddled the other horse, a skittish mare she'd only watched Thomas handle, and followed the riderless horse's backtrack into the hills. She tracked not by sound, but by the story in the dirt. A scuffed rock here, a broken branch there, the quiet testimony of a world that spoke to her in ways no one else could hear. She found him 2 miles into the rocky foothills, lying at the base of a shallow ravine. His leg was bent at a sickening angle, his face pale with pain and shock. He had fallen, the horse had spooked, and he had been lying there for a night and a day. When he saw her, his eyes, glazed with agony, widened in disbelief. She was the last person he expected, and the only one who had come. She slid down the slope, her dress tearing on rocks. She had no voice to call for help, no way to reassure him with words, so she did the only thing she could. She knelt, placed her hands firmly on either side of his face, forcing him to look at her. She made the sign for strong, a fist flexing at her chest. Then she pointed to herself and to him and clasped her hands together. "I am here, we are together." Getting him out was a feat of silent, brutal engineering. She used his belt and a broken branch to splint his leg. She calmed the mare with steady, deliberate movements. With impossible strength, she half-dragged, half-supported him up the slope, using the horse as a living winch. Every gasp of pain from Thomas was a vibration she felt through his body. They didn't speak. They operated as a single, desperate organism. By the time she got him into the wagon at the foot of the hills, the sun was high. She drove the wagon home with a focus that blotted out everything, the bank, the town, the future. The only thing that existed was the man groaning behind her and the road home. The doctor from Cedar Ridge, when summoned, refused to come. "I don't treat patients where that kind of communication is used," was the message sent back with the boy who fetched him. It was a death sentence of a different kind. So Elena became the doctor. She set Thomas's leg using a manual she found in Silas's old trunk, her hands steady as she pulled the bone into alignment, Thomas biting down on a leather strap, his scream a silent convulsion she saw but did not hear. She brewed willow bark tea, packed the wound with honey and clean muslin. She slept in a chair by his bed, waking to check for fever. For a week, the ranch stood still. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the room, the injury, and the intricate, silent dance of care. During that week, language evolved from necessity to lifeline. Thomas, trapped in bed, began to point at things: water, window, pain. Elena would show him the sign. He would mimic it, clumsy at first, then with growing confidence. They built a vocabulary of need and comfort. The sign for hurt was a finger jab to the location. The sign for thank you was a flat hand touched to the chin and moved outward. One afternoon, in a moment of frustration with a spilled cup, Thomas made a jagged, angry gesture. Elena calmly took his hand and reshaped it into the proper sign for angry, a clawed hand over the heart. He laughed, a hoarse, pained sound. She smiled. In that broken room, they were no longer a rancher and a mail-order bride. They were student and teacher, patient and nurse, two people building a dialect all their own. On the 8th day, the bank's final day, Thomas could sit up. Elena brought him the ledger and the few coins from her preserves. It was hopeless. He looked at the numbers, then at her, his face grim. He made a sign she didn't know, a cutting motion across his throat. Finished. Elena shook her head. She went out to the porch and returned with a single, perfect jar of raspberry preserves. She set it on the ledger, covering the red, negative numbers. She then pointed to Thomas, to his leg, to herself, and finally made a sweeping gesture that took in the entire ranch. We are still here. That is the asset. They were sitting in that silent defiance when the sound of multiple wagons arrived. Not just Carruthers, but a small crowd from Cedar Ridge, the sheriff, the doctor, a few curious, hard-faced men. Carruthers held the final foreclosure papers. The doctor wore a look of smug vindication. Thomas struggled to stand, but Elena placed a firm hand on his shoulder. She walked out onto the porch alone. Carruthers began to speak, but Elena held up a single hand. She turned, went inside, and helped Thomas to his feet, supporting him as he hobbled to the doorway. The sight of the injured man leaning on the woman they had all scorned gave the crowd pause. Thomas spoke, his voice weak but clear. "You've come to take my land. On the word of a man," he glanced at the doctor, "who wouldn't set a bone for a dying dog." The doctor flushed. Thomas continued, "The debt is to the bank, not to the town, so state your business and go." Carruthers cleared his throat. "The debt is unpaid. The land is forfeit at sundown." It was then that Mrs. Porter, the blacksmith's wife, stepped forward from the back of the crowd. She was not alone. With her were the young mother who had bought preserves and two other women. Mrs. Porter walked right past the men up to the porch. She didn't look at them. She looked at Elena and she began to sign. Her movements were slow, unpracticed, but unmistakable. She signed "Good, strong, friend." Then she turned to Carruthers and spoke in a voice that carried, "My husband and I will cover the reed note. We'll hold the paper." A murmur went through the men. The blacksmith was a respected, solvent man. Carruthers was stunned. "On what collateral?" Mrs. Porter pointed at Elena, then at the garden, the budding orchard, the repaired house. "On her." It was not charity. It was a business proposition based on observed value. The other women nodded. The men, faced with this sudden, quiet solidarity, shuffled their feet. The doctor's moral authority crumbled in the face of practical community sense. Carruthers, outmaneuvered, had no choice. The deal was struck on the porch, with Thomas leaning on Elena and a handful of women standing as silent guarantors. The bank would get its money. The Reeds would get time. The crisis passed, but the change was permanent. Thomas healed, though with a lasting limp. The orchard took root. The R. Reed Ranch preserves, made from Elena's recipes and Thomas's labor, found a steady market, first with the women of Cedar Ridge, then beyond. The most surprising detail was not the business, but the school. It started with the children of the women who had supported them. They were curious about the hand talk. Elena, hesitant at first, began teaching them simple signs on the porch after church. It was a game to them, but it was a revolution to her. She was not just communicating, she was passing on her language. Thomas, watching from the corral one afternoon, saw a group of children successfully ask Elena for a drink of water using only signs. He saw the look of pure, unguarded joy on her face. That evening, he brought her a gift. It was a small, beautifully carved wooden sign, a shingle. On it he had burned two words, Shore School. He pointed to her, then to the shingle, then to the children's imaginary seats on the porch. Her school, her name. She cried then, soundless tears that held years of being unnamed. Years flowed like the creek after rain. The ranch prospered modestly. The orchard bore fruit. The Shore School became a quiet, accepted oddity, then a minor point of pride for a town softening at the edges. Elena never heard a child's laugh, but she saw it. She never heard Thomas say he loved her, but he showed her every day in the way he made sure she could see his lips when he spoke, in the new signs he invented for her, in the protected space he built around her world. The final surprise came 2 decades later, found in a box of Thomas's things after he passed. It was the original, crumpled foreclosure notice from Carothers. On the back, in Thomas's rough hand, was a sentence. He must have written it sometime during his convalescence, a man grappling with a new reality. It read, "I thought I needed a woman who could listen. I was wrong. I needed a woman who could make me see." That single sentence on the back of a bankruptcy notice was more than a man's private thought. It was a verdict on an entire way of seeing the world. For Elena Shaw and thousands like her in the deaf communities of the 19th century, the fight was never really about being heard. It was about the fundamental right to be understood. The Shore School on the porch didn't last forever, but the idea did. It was a tiny, defiant outpost against the oralist tide championed by men like Alexander Graham Bell, who believed signing was a primitive step backward. While institutions were forbidding hand gestures, a deaf woman on a Montana ranch was teaching them to hearing children, turning a supposed liability into a shared language. Her story is a single thread in a much larger tapestry of resistance, where deaf individuals built networks, married, created art, and forged identity despite laws and attitudes designed to erase them. We began with a hook about illegality. We end with a legacy about legacy. The ranch, the orchard, the school, they were all physical proof that a different value system could take root, one based on perception, patience, and visual intelligence. Thomas Reed didn't get the wife he thought he ordered. He got a partner who redefined his entire metric for worth. She didn't fix his hearing, she expanded his vision. Today, the struggle echoes. It's in the fight for recognition of sign languages as complete, complex linguistic systems. It's in the ongoing battle for accessibility and against the assumption that disability diminishes personhood. Elena's journey from rejected mail-order bride to a teacher, a businesswoman, and a cornerstone of her community reminds us that human potential is never defined by a single missing sense, but by the profound adaptability of the human spirit to connect. So the next time you encounter a barrier, a difference, a person the world has deemed less than, remember the quiet cowboy and the deaf widow. Their story asks us a simple, enduring question. Are we listening to the world only through our own ears, or are we brave enough to learn a new way to see? If you found this story of hidden history and human connection compelling, make sure you subscribe. We delve into the forgotten narratives that shaped our world, one unexpected life at a time. Thanks for watching.